Everyone, welcome to our 5th weekly podcast as we explore the narrative literature of pre-modern India. Now we're leaving the Ramayana behind, but we're still going to be in the story world of the Ramayana as we explore a great courtly epic, or Mahakavya, called the Raghuvaṃśa, the lineage of Raghu, which tells all about the adventures that happened to Rama's ancestors, to Rama himself, and then to his descendants, who all form part of what's called the Solar Dynasty, or the Suryavamsha in the classical Indian tradition. Now, the Raghuvaṃśa is a long, incredible poem composed by Kālidāsa, who's universally regarded as the greatest Sanskrit poet of all time, so this should be kind of fun. Now, in our readings for this week, we're going to be concentrating on how Kālidāsa embellishes the story of Aja, who's Rama's grandfather. And so in this podcast, I wanted to kind of go over 3 things, basically, to get us started. First, let's talk a bit about Kālidāsa and the interesting legends that surround this poet within the Indian imagination. Second, we'll talk about what makes Sanskrit poetry poetry and not just ordinary speech. And we're going to focus on 2 kinds of literary devices, which are called alaṃkāras and rasas, ornaments and emotional essences. And then finally, we're going to do a quick rundown of the stories of Rama's ancestors so that we get familiar with the text as we begin to read the story of Aja on our own. So let's get started with a look at some of the facts and legends that swirl around Mr. Perfect himself, the great poet Kālidāsa. Now, Kālidāsa is almost universally regarded as the greatest Sanskrit poet of all time, so much so that sometime around the year 1000, a great Sanskrit scholar by the name of Abhinavagupta had declared that not even in their imagination, in a dream world, would connoisseurs impute even the most minute imperfections to his poetry. Now, that's quite a tall order to live up to, but let's see, right? Who was this Kālidāsa, you might ask? Well, depends on who you ask, basically. Now, literally, if you think about it, billions of people have continuously been memorizing and cherishing Kālidāsa's poetry for more than 1,500 years. And as you might expect, this means that there are lots and lots of different understandings about this poet's life that just kind of float in the public imagination. And there's basically 2 main ideas within this public tradition itself, both of which probably aren't historically true. Now, one legend puts him as one of the 9 jewels of a legendary king named Vikramaditya, who had lived around 57 BC and has all kinds of fascinating adventures on his own. We can't really pin this Vikramaditya down very easily to history. Another king named Bhoja, who lived around 1000 CE, we can actually pin down fairly well historically. And some people also, there's a legend about how Kālidāsa was a court poet at Bhoja's court in Dhara, a city in today's Madhya Pradesh. All kinds of interesting legends are there about Kālidāsa in this court as well, but again, none of them can be really pinned down with historical accuracy. Bhoja can be pinned down, but not Kālidāsa at Bhoja's court. Now, whether he was at Vikramaditya's court or Bhoja's court, there's a very famous legendary biography that gets attached to Kālidāsa. Kālidāsa kind of starts out as a moron, basically. He's a foolish cowherd who was spotted by a court pundit named Vararuchi, who is trying to find somebody to defeat the local princess in a Sanskrit contest. This princess was incredibly smart. She was learned. She was beautiful, of course. And she'd made her father promise her that he would marry her off only to someone who was smarter than she was, who could defeat her in a debate. So Vararuchi brought this numbskull, this idiot Kālidāsa, to the court, where actually Kālidāsa manages to defeat the princess Vasanti in a philosophical debate, basically without even trying. what happens is that he makes all these stupid gestures, but everyone keeps interpreting his moronic gestures as being like some deeply philosophical messages. So he wins, and they get married. But then later, the princess realizes that Kālidāsa is stupid. He doesn't know Sanskrit, actually. And so she kicks him out of the house. Kālidāsa then goes and worships the goddess Kali, who shows him her grace and blesses him with a complete mastery of the Sanskrit language. Now, instead of going back to domestic life with the princess, Kālidāsa leaves to pursue a poetic career. He winds up in Bhoja's court, maybe, or in Vikramaditya's, whatever you like, and he solves a poetic riddle there and becomes the court poet. Then he starts composing all kinds of poems and plays, and more adventures also ensue. Now that's the legend of Kālidāsa as a moron who becomes blessed by Kali and becomes the smartest poet in the world. Historians, though, have discovered other facts that are worth considering when we pin him down to some historical time. For one, most historians place Kālidāsa as being a poet of the Gupta imperial court in the city of Ujjain, which is in Madhya Pradesh again, and living around the years 400 to 450 CE, sometime in that time period. This is because of a number of little details that people have gathered from his poetry and also from evidence outside of his poetry. First, the Gupta king Chandragupta Chandragupta II was also nicknamed Vikramaditya, so you can kind of attach him to that. His successors were named Kumaragupta and Skandagupta. Now, Kālidāsa has a romantic play called the Vikramurvashiya, which you could tie to this Vikramaditya, and also an epic poem called the Kumara Sambhava, which describes the birth of the god Kumara, Shiva's son. But the theory is that maybe this is actually commemorating the birth of this Kumara Gupta instead as well. So Kālidāsa's writings also kind of have some other clues. They are often set in areas around Ujjain. He's really fascinated by Ujjain. And he also actually mentions the Huns as occupying the country of Bactria. Now, Bactria is located in modern-day Afghanistan. The Huns historically hadn't taken over Bactria, which was Indo-Greek, before that, until around the 400s, the early 400s. And then they would eventually come and attack Ujjain in 510 and sort of wipe out the Guptas there. So there's your kind of lower and upper limits of when Kālidāsa would have lived in the Gupta court, according to the theory. Now, no matter which theory you believe, the legends or the historians, we know that Kālidāsa wrote quite a lot of really incredible Sanskrit poetry. First, there's his two courtly epics called the Mahakavyas, as these are known, which are the Raghuvaṃśa and the Kumara Sambhava, the line of Raghu and the birth of Kumara. Then there's three plays or natyas that he wrote. The first is a romance, Malavika Agnimitra. Then there's a very famous romance called The Recognition of Shakuntala, Abhijnana Shakuntalam. And finally, there's the Vikramurvashiya that I'd mentioned earlier. He also has another very famous short poem called The Cloud Messenger, or Meghaduta, that is known as a Sandesha Kavya. It's the story of a cloud who travels the entire country of India to deliver the message of a fellow who's been cursed to be separated from his beloved, his lover. It's really an exquisite kind of superimposition of the power of emotions of love and separation, which is called Vipralamba in Sanskrit, on top of the geographical and cultural features of the Indian subcontinent. It's fascinating reading, actually. What makes Kālidāsa's poetry really something special are three things in particular. First and foremost is that he has this kind of exquisite and very delicate imagination that allows him to make all kinds of unbelievable comparisons or similes, which are called upamas in Sanskrit, in which he compares beautiful emotional states and scenes and sort of the delicacy of beauty, really, with the human beauty, with the imagery of nature, of forests and gardens and birds and animals and so on. It's really a lovely kind of tender stuff. Then there's his very sweet and elegant use of words and sounds, which gives his poetry what David Shulman calls a musical pulsation to it. And finally, there's a very subtle development in his plays of what aesthetic scholars called rasa, or the emotional essences through which various scenes or incidents are made to just sort of stir the hearts of the reader or the audience in the play. Now, let's talk a little bit actually about these ideas of poetic figures like similes and so on, and rasas, these aesthetic markers, and how they work together to make Sanskrit poetry such an intricate and sophisticated and really such a powerful form of culture, so much so that it's been kept alive for more than 2,000 years in India, and it's actually come to impact poetry all across Asia and even into China and Indonesia, actually. Poeticians and literary scholars have gone to great depths to describe all the different aspects of what makes Sanskrit poetry so beautiful. I just want to kind of mention two key ideas and make sure we understand them, or at least get acquainted with them. These are called alaṃkāra and rasa. Now let's find out what these are. Alaṃkāras are poetic figures or ornaments that are used to make language beautiful or unusual. The most basic of these is the simile, upama. This is when two unlike things are compared. So you can say, for example, her face is like the moon. Right? Here we've kept her face and the moon as two different things, but they're placed in comparison next to each other. Then there's a rupaka, or metaphor, where you kind of make these two things merge. So you can say, I saw her moon face glisten in the evening. Right? Here, the moon is being kind of merged into her face so that the two entities are treated as one. Right? Then there are even more complicated figures like the Dīpaka, or illuminator, where one property is bound together with one property binds together two or more distinct entities. So take, for example, the following. Your face upon my eyes in these dark times, and the moon on the blue lotuses in the dark night. They both shine on. Right? Here, all kinds of things are being compared in some ways, but it's not using a simile or a metaphor. It's by kind of linking them by the act of shining. Now, there's a figure called a yamaka as well, or a repetition or rhyme, where the same word or syllables are repeated, but with different meanings sometimes and for different interesting kind of effects. Like here's one, face it, your face is the moon, right? The repetition of face, but different usages kind of creates poetry. Now, Sanskrit poetry has dozens of other kinds of ways in which you can embellish your speech so that it's no longer ordinary, but it's poetic. And for centuries, poets tried to kind of outdo each other in these royal courts in how they used alaṃkāras, these figures, and then they'd be competing to win contests and gain sort of great fame and prestige and money and fame, right? Basically, right, all across the country. Now, that was the world of poetry. In the world of Sanskrit theater, which is kind of different from poetry for a long time, there was a different kind of understanding of beauty or pleasure that was being cultivated. There was an idea here called rasa, or sentiment, emotional essence, flavor that persisted within a play. The idea was that just like if you're eating a dish, right, in food, and you put masalas and sauces on it to make it tasty and flavorful, the idea is that there's something you can add to just an ordinary scene that's being depicted on stage to make it full of emotion, to make it real in that sense. Now, we'll be looking at rasa a lot more when we look at drama in the next couple of weeks, but here's just a sneak peek to get us thinking about it. Rasa now literally means juice. It's like the ras of a fruit. It's the essence or the flavor. And in theater, it's the idea that there's a controlled, distilled, aesthetic experience of emotion as an essence, as opposed to like how we usually experience emotions, which are in transitory sort of muddled states in real life, right? Usually we have reactions to things that are emotional. Those emotional reactions are called bhavas in Sanskrit. So there's rasa and then there's bhava. Bhavas are what people experience in ordinary day-to-day life. Rasas are generated through literary acts of communication between a poet and his audiences, or her audiences, in the medium of a play, and where the story world is being kind of merged with the reality of the actors who are doing the acting. This merger of acting and story is what creates the heightened and abstracted experiences of rasa. There are 8 classical rasas in the Sanskrit system, with a 9th that's later added. We'll talk more detail about these later. The pleasant ones are shrungara, or passion and love. Then there's hasya, or comedy, vira, glory or valor, ashcharya, or wonder and amazement. Then there's 4 unpleasant ones, which are karuna, or misery, raudra, or rage and fury, then bhayanaka, which is fear or terror, bibhatsa, which is horror or disgust. Then eventually there's a 9th one that's added to the list, shanta, or peace, stillness. And this is what happens when there's actually a lack of any of these other 8 rasas. When all emotional flavor ceases, then you get ultimate peace. Okay, so with that overview of alaṃkāras and rasas, let's turn to the Raghuvaṃśa itself and get a sense of how it's structured as a text, and go over the individual stories of the kings that come just before our hero Aja enters the stage, as a way to kind of launch us into the reading the text. The Raghuvaṃśa belongs to a genre of poetry called Mahakāvya. Maha is cognate with mega. Basically, it means a grand poem, mega poem, right? We can call it the courtly epic sometimes. Mahakavyas are usually well-known stories, the plots people know already, and they're presented in episodes called sargas, or cantos, which are groups of verses that are all composed in the same meter. So they're sung together. Each verse is like a little jewel of poetry, a little nugget that's been strung together by the plot to make a necklace in some ways, right? It's one of the hardest things you're supposed to be able to do as a Sanskrit poet, they say, is to write a successful Mahakavya. Anyway, Kālidāsa's Raghuvaṃśa is pretty successful, and it tells the chronicles of what's known as the Solar Dynasty in the ancient Indian tradition, the Suryavamsha in Sanskrit. This is the dynasty of Rama's family, and his story is actually at the center of the Raghuvaṃśa. The first part of the epic tells the stories of his ancestors, starting with Dilīpa, and then going down to his dad Dasharatha. Then Kālidāsa tells the whole story of the Ramayana, actually, including even when Rama kicks Sita out. Then he goes on to tell the story of Rama's kids, his grandkids, his great-grandkids, and so on and so forth, until he eventually gets to the end of the line, a sorry fellow named Agnivarna who gets some horrible STD, and then eventually is murdered by his ministers. He's assassinated in the royal gardens in a coup d'etat. It's kind of a terrible ending anyway. Now, you're welcome to read that part on your own. I think it's fascinating, actually. But I wanted to go over the stories of the 3 kings before Dasharatha, Dilīpa, Raghu, and Aja, to kind of whet our appetites, get us started in reading the text, and finish off our podcast. Now, first, Dilīpa and his encounters with the wish-giving cow. Now, Dilīpa was a Solar Dynasty king who found himself without offspring. It's a very common thing, actually, in this family. After some digging around, he and his wife discovered the reason. It's because he had once accidentally offended a wish-giving cow, Kamadhenu. This Kamadhenu, this cow, had cursed him that he wouldn't have kids, and so to fix things, he and his wife now have to take care of that cow's daughter, named Nandini, who's also herself a wish-giving cow. And that's what they start to do. They sit out in the forest with the cow every day. One time, while Dilīpa is sitting with the cow, she gets attacked by a lion. Dilīpa then nobly offers himself to the lion instead of the cow to kind of sacrifice himself for her. At that point, the cow reveals that the whole thing was a big illusion. It was a test of Dilīpa's honor, his dharma. He's passed, and so the cow gives him a son. This is the king named Raghu. Raghu is a world conqueror. He's an imperialist. And he also has an encounter. This time it's with a Brahmin sage. And let's see how this story goes. Raghu goes on all kinds of different sort of imperial adventures as a young man, builds up his empire, eventually succeeds in conquering all of the kings of the earth. Once he's finished with that, he has a huge sacrifice, an imperial Vishvajit sacrifice, in which he actually ends up giving away all of the wealth that he's accumulated back to the kings who he had conquered, as well as to all kinds of Brahmin priests who are running the show. Then at a certain point, a young Brahmin monk named Gotsa comes and asks the king for a favor. Gotsa owes his guru a large fee, and he asks the king to help him pay for it. Raghu says sure, but he's got no money. And so he decides that he should go to war on Kubera himself, the god of wealth himself. Now, Kubera gets kind of scared at that point, and so he preemptively showers Raghu's treasury with massive amounts of gold that fall down from the heavens. Raghu's rich, right? So he gives Gotsa the money that he needs. Gotsa is happy, and he rewards the king with a son who's named Aja. Now to the romantic tale of Aja, this is the story we're going to look at this week. Aja is a handsome guy. He's strong, brave, just like all of his ancestors. As a teenager, he's able to defeat a mad elephant. An elephant turns out to have been a celestial being who is cursed to be an elephant. As a reward, this being, the celestial, gives him a magic spear that'll cause his enemies to go to sleep when he launches it. Kind of nice to have. Later, Aja is invited to attend a marriage contest, a swayamvara, of the beautiful princess Indumati. Indumati is going to get to choose her husband, and out of all the kings, she chooses Aja. Right? But the other suitors get upset by this because, look, remember, they'd already been defeated by Aja's father, Raghu, and now he's like, they're all jealous, right? So then they attack the couple as they're going home after the marriage. There's a huge fight. Aja defeats the kings using his sleep spear, so nobody gets killed, they just fall asleep. Later, Indumati eventually gives birth to Dasharatha, Rama's dad, and it seems like the family's going to have a happy life. All of a sudden, kind of like at random, Indumati drops dead. And then Aja's just heartbroken. His heart shatters, basically. The verses he sings after she dies, Aja's lament, is really just an incredible piece of poetry. You should really be sure to read that. We'll discuss it, of course. Eventually, after some years, Aja gets stricken with disease. He lives a really terrible life at the end there, and he fasts unto death at the edge of the Sarayu River and the Ganga, and goes back to meet his long-lost wife. That's when Dasharatha now takes over and continues the brilliant history of the Solar Dynasty. The story goes on from here, but we're going to stop and start reading the poetic version of Aja's life as Kālidāsa portrays it. And I'd like for us to look to see if we can find how different kinds of emotional essences, these rasas, are developed within Kālidāsa's Mahakāvya, the line of Raghu. So let's crack open our ebooks and get to appreciating some Sanskrit poetry, and I'll see you next time.